So this conversation, thank you all for being here again, is to explore the current state of extremism and hate, the factors that are leading people to extremism and hate, and most importantly, what we are doing, what civil society is doing, law enforcement, individuals are doing to combat this threat. And that's really, I think, the key of this discussion. So let me read a couple short bios, and we'll get started. So it's an honor to have this panel together here. First is Mitch Silber, who's the founding principal at the Guardian Group, an intelligence and security consulting firm. Just because I'm reading this, it doesn't mean I don't know this, but I just want you to know that. Mitch served as director of intelligence analysis at the New York City Police Department, where he was the principal advisor to the Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence on counterterrorism policy and analysis. He was responsible for developing and managing the analytic and cyber units and supervised the research collection and analysis for the Intelligence Division's entire portfolio of ongoing terrorism-related investigations. Mr. Silber was responsible for strategic assessment of emerging and future threats to the city of New York and was involved in the internal planning development and new unit creation for the department. Mitch has also initiated and managed relations with foreign intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Personally, Mitch, thank you for keeping our city safe for all these years. So, Mitch Silber. To Mitch's left is Jesse Morton. He was once a prominent radicalizer in the West as co-founder and chief propagandist of Revolution Muslim, a New York City-based group active in the 2000s. He helped to insert the narrative of Al-Qaeda and Salafi jihadist ideology into the American ambit. He currently heads Parallel Networks, an American nonprofit which provides consultancy on international projects and is the research coordinator for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue Against Violence Network in North America. My anecdote about Jesse is that I have known Jesse in multiple different ways over the years, for the first several in ways that I never thought would put us on the stage together. I used to monitor him very, very closely. And now I'm pleased to say that I monitor his incredible work that he does throughout the country. So Jesse. And last but certainly not least, my colleague, Caroline Nutt. She's the ADL Center on Extremism Terrorism analyst. Caroline focuses on Islamist extremism, both at home and abroad, researching tactics, trends, and online activity. She also trains law enforcement officers around the country on threats issued by foreign terrorist organizations towards the United States, especially with regard to radicalization and lone actor terrorism. Before joining ADL, she worked at Dataminr as the Middle East Research Desk Manager, using proprietary algorithms to supply Department of Defense clients with real-time developments surfacing from the region. Caroline is one of our sort of rising star analysts. Caroline, thank you for being here. And she's currently going to school at GW. Anyway, okay. So let's just start. Again, we're trying to understand first, sort of assess what is the actual terror threat picture, the role of online environments, how are people radicalized, and then what are we doing in response? So Mitch, let me start with you. You recently published a study that looked at the threat in particular to Jewish communities, both here in the United States and abroad. And I think you found your study had very, I think, surprising for some, sort of analysis about what the difference is between these threats. So can you talk a little bit about those differences and specifically what we're facing here in the U.S.?
Sure. Thank you, Oren, and thank you, ADL, for having me here today. Always great to be speaking in front of this audience. This was an analysis of terrorist plots against Jewish targets, both in Europe and the United States, and trying to see what are the similarities and what are the differences. And as we heard earlier this morning in the plenary session from Milan Carr, not surprisingly, we knew in Europe, and we can talk about Toulouse in 2012, we can talk about 2014 in Copenhagen, the hyper-cacher attack, terrorist attacks in Europe that were primarily found their point of origination in Islamist terrorist plots, either people connected to Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, or people who were mobilized by Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and that's what triggered them into action. And anti-Semitism was a part of the ideology that they followed and that they believed as part of their mission they had to kill Jews. Switch, across the Atlantic and come to the United States, and fortunately, up until recently, we didn't have many data points on this issue. But we did have Pittsburgh, we did recently have Poway, and if you went back a couple of years, you could look at Kansas City and an attempted shooting in the United States. And I think, what's happening in the United States is even our terminology is changing, because we wouldn't have called these terrorist plots previously, but in fact, that's exactly what they are. And maybe that was the first realization, because there's an ideology that's guiding these people, and there's a political end that they want. And in the US, a lot of it has to do with this idea of the replacement theory. And this is a theory that came out in Europe, a French philosopher, Camus, and the idea is that, well, wait a second, the white people are being replaced by brown people. And we say, well, how does that relate to Jews? Well, Jews are the enabler of that. Jews are facilitating that immigration, and the attack in Pittsburgh is so clearly linked to that because Bowers, the attacker, linked Jews to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which in a previous iteration helped Jewish immigrants and refugees, and now is helping other refugees. So ideology matters. It is political in nature. And it seemed like the trend line in the US is on the rise, and my conclusion with the US is right now the epicenter for right-wing terrorists against Jewish targets.
Right. I want to just underscore one point that Mitch made about sort of this ideology and where the Jews fit in it. Because when you think of white supremacists who are responsible for the majority of extremist-related murders over a long period of time, you say, why is it that the Jews are the targets when they're focusing on immigration? They're focusing on opposition to African Americans, demographic changes, by the way, PC culture, liberalism, multiculturalism, diversity. Well, in some ways, white supremacists, as much as they hate immigrants and African Americans, et cetera, they actually don't really view them as human. They're subhuman. And so they're concerned about the extinction of the white race, but to suggest that those people might lead to that, gives them a sense of power that they don't believe they have. But who has the power? It's the Jews. The Jews are manipulating them. They're the puppet masters. And that's why the Jews are targeted when you see times of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and misogynistic rhetoric on the rise. So, Caroline, to you, what is this resurgence linked to beyond sort of what we're seeing on the ground? Does online environment play a role in the resurgence that we're seeing across the world, but specifically in the United States?
Thank you, Oren. So in our conversations at ADL and with law enforcement and in our work holistically, you can't understand extremism today without understanding the online platforms upon which these extremists operate. It could be Islamist, it could be someone who is interested in studying Salafi jihadist ideology or right-wing extremism, anything from anti-government to white supremacy. But at the base of it, these platforms are the megaphones through which they are able to amplify their voices. And we call them, you can think of them somewhat as an echo chamber of hate. And really virtual 24/7, round the clock, white supremacist rallies upon which these extremists can amplify their vitriolic hate. And so there's 3 points that, really, when we think about online platforms and the roles that they play in promulgating extremism. First, you think about, again, the ability for these individuals to reach millions of users. Not anymore like you think back a couple decades ago before social media really came into play, and it was, of course, your physical networks, your family, your friends, your colleagues, and now you're able to reach people. Most of you probably between the sessions were scrolling through Instagram or Facebook or some sort of platform to connect with your larger network. Well, so too are these extremists, and this is how they reach thousands, if not millions of people through these networks. The second being these online spaces offer community, and it's about a sense of belonging, finding purpose, and in that, in these spaces, in these virtual communities, this is where people are really able to turn this into, or basically what you would find in, again, a relationship with a friend or a family. It's people who really share this same ideology. And the last point going off of that is this is where in these communities you find validation and kind of you sanction these beliefs, these kind of hateful thoughts, and they become normalized. And this is where people, like we saw with the Pittsburgh shooter, Bowers, or even in Christchurch in New Zealand, where they are able to work off of this hate and move to violence. And recently we, at ADL, Center on Extremism, we did a study with a partner at the Network Contagion Research Institute in Princeton, looking at how online forums and hate speech were able to really amplify these two specific horrific massacres and their shooters to move to violence. And you found the common denominator between that was the kind of same rhetoric of white genocide, victimization, and really, again, kind of playing off of the notion that this was kind of a duty that these guys had to go out and accomplish.
So you have a proliferation of online networks, Twitter, Facebook, Google. By the way, those are not even close to being the most significant in many ways for those of us that are spending time looking for extremist threats, right? I've said this a million times, it's sort of a mantra, but I learn about new technology from two places, from ISIS and white supremacists and from my 8-year-old son. These are the early adopters to technology. So we know that there's more online spaces. The ability to reach, recruit, and radicalize, as you were saying, is easy as ever before. The question is, though, so there's all this hate on there. What is driving people to go even read that in the first place? And so this is where, Jesse, I wanted to ask you, because you have such a unique sort of perspective on radicalization. It's more than ideology, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, what is bringing somebody to even want to explore the type of answers that extremists are providing in these spaces?
So I think that it is very clearly evident that we are living in a progressively polarized society and culture. And there are people that are isolated and that lack that meaning, significance, and purpose that some of us find in productive outlets. Unfortunately, what we have online is we have a process where, because there's been efforts to take down violent extremist propaganda or pro-terrorist propaganda like ISIS off Twitter and Facebook, the adjustment has pushed them to the darker corners of the net, which are harder to monitor. But traditionally, what we fail to understand in the process of radicalization is it's not a nefarious recruiter looking to recruit the vulnerable and susceptible. It's, as we used to put it, pulling from a medieval scholar in Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah, the objective is not to convert the entire of humanity. It is to make the truth available to those that seek it. So people start to seek for meaning, purpose, and belonging online, and what they'll run into is they'll run into a conveyor belt or an incubator, someone who is radical but not violent extremist. And that's the space that Revolution Muslims sort of tried to carefully toe that line of the First Amendment, as everyone understands very well, is we were able to avoid terms of service shutdown. We were able to look at how we could play off of and manipulate the media to cover us, which was our recruitment tool, to cover us in a way where 99% of the audience would think that we were despicable, but that 1% that didn't know that we existed was our primary recruitment ground, and our numbers would grow exponentially. And from there, we could get you on YouTube, we could get you on Twitter, we could get you on Facebook, we could get you on our website, but it was then that we could transfer you to more obscure platforms. We used one called Paltalk, which everyone was shocked by when Snowden's documents came out, and they said, what is Paltalk? But everyone that was in the space of extremism knew very well what Paltalk was, because it was being utilized by terrorists to facilitate, they let anything go there, free speech, under their interpretation of it, anything was applicable. So it's this sort of rabbit hole understanding that we need to get at. And the problem is if you address the radical cognitive space with tactics and techniques and strategies that should, or more appropriately, be applied to the violent extremist space, or you address the violent extremist space with tactics and strategies that should be more appropriated towards cognitive radical spaces, then you can actually have haphazard consequences in understanding how this process works. And you can actually make it worse by contesting it than actually making it better. So unless we understand technological shifts and unless we understand that extremism is adaptive and it's fluid, and we stay as adaptive and we stay, like your ADL monitoring services are absolutely essential, because one thing about terrorism and violent extremism is it can shift at the blink of an eye. Right? And if you're not there to notice that shift and you don't notice that step into those more darker corners of the internet, then you're not in the space where this stuff is occurring and you don't understand the mutations of the narratives.
Yeah, to that last point, we sort of talk about the FOMO sort of issue. Y'all know what FOMO is? Fear of missing out, something I feel all the time. So the reason I mention this is that in monitoring extremists, like the tactic is, if there's a Telegram channel, that they will go to another channel. And in order to have the password to that or be able to keep going there, you have to constantly engage with that online radical space. And the more that you're engaging and trying to, not miss out on where they're going next, the more, in a sense, you're getting radicalized. And so that's the tactics that they're using. Go ahead.
It's a game of whack-a-mole, in a way. You have to constantly be on and monitoring these platforms and able to keep up with them, because Telegram, for example, has private and public channels, and the private channels are where we want to be when we're trying to monitor plans and plots and radicalization. But those change all the time, every day.
So we've seen in particular, Christchurch, an attempt in Poway, most recently in Germany, the Yom Kippur attack against the synagogue, that people are actually live streaming their attacks. They're bringing people on the journey with them, not just through the celebration of, propaganda that glorifies violence, but saying, literally signaling back to their community, I'm about to do this, come join me. So, Mitch, to you, this is something we saw ISIS do in different ways, whether it was like beheading videos or some of the... So are you seeing white supremacist tactics, whether it's online or others, start to catch up with what you saw for so long regarding ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you can draw a direct line from the attack on the hyper-kosher supermarket in France, where one of the attackers was wearing a GoPro, right? So he was streaming it live as he went into that supermarket, as he identified who was a Jew and who was not a Jew, killed Jews, and essentially had this hostage situation. It all played out live, from his GoPro. So then fast forward to this past Yom Kippur, where within 24 hours of the event in Halle, and just because I was on the gamer channel in which he wore a camera, like a GoPro on top of his helmet, you could watch him, come to the synagogue, try and shoot with his shotgun, the lock open. That failed. He had an improvised explosive device. He stuck it into the wedge of the door. That didn't work. He tossed a few over the wall. A woman told him, "You're making too much noise." He shot her in the middle of the street. This is all, he's videotaping this live and streaming it. He drove down the street, went to the halal, shop, shot people in there who were just having lunch, and he wanted to glorify himself, record this, and in a sense, make his own martyrdom, if you will, something that would mobilize others to act. And that's another phenomena. We talked about looking at Europe, looking at the US. In a lot of these right-wing extremist attacks, they are referencing previous attacks. They want to emulate them, and they want their attack to be on par, if not better. Brandon Tarrant in New Zealand, who carried out that horrific attack against the mosque, he was looking at other previous right-wing attackers, Breivik in Scandinavia, among others, and trying to say, look, I'm going to do that and one better.
Yeah. I just have to say that you were on Twitch. That means you're a gamer. I love that, and I'm going to move on.
I also have young kids who are on gaming sites.
Yeah. So I think what we can't forget is that, and I know this is going to maybe sound a little crass, but the type of propaganda that you just described and that is available is really compelling. It's really sexy stuff. And frankly, a lot of it is a lot better than some of the counter materials that are out there. That's just a hard truth. You can see why people would be sort of brought into the movement and be interested, because they're really good at making the types of materials that suck people in. And by the way, the video of the shooting in Germany, you can find that right now. I mean, I'm not going to show you, but I can go to multiple channels where it is currently available right now. And why? To honestly try to create and inspire the next person to get the next high score. The more kills is the next high score. And so, okay, I think we sucked the air out of this room. It's a little depressing. But let's now turn it into what can we do about this? And I think there's actually a lot more in terms of response that's happening than people realize. So Jesse, I'd love to start with you. Parallel Networks has, as part of its mission, is to try to counter radicalization and try to get individuals disengaged from the movement, renounce their former extremist lives, and bring them into I guess, a process that you went through. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're doing in Parallel?
So I think that it's very important for us to describe what we do with a parallel network, which is basically defined as building a network that is antithetical to hate and extremism, but that can offer the same sense of meaning, purpose, and significance that extremists offer their recruits. So we don't just look at it as trying to identify an individual who needs to be engaged within an intervention orientation to de-radicalize them, so to say. What we look at is reverse engineering the process that I talked about earlier. Using counter-narrative techniques and strategies and getting embedded inside of those areas in the darknet to let people know that there is an organization out there that is also producing flashy material. We have 2 magazines. We took back English language jihadi magazines. We just recently launched a counter-right-wing initiative that has narratives of individual former extremists on the right that have left the movement and talks about the very similar philosophical principles upon which jihadism and far-right-wing extremism are built, and how there's a transnational mutation inside of the right-wing extremist organizations that are starting to solidify around Great Replacement and anti-Semitism. And so what we see is this ability to take a network approach rather than an approach focused on individuals, and we're taking counter narratives and opposing the hate speech with productive messaging and providing an alternative. They then reach out to us as individuals having read the magazine, or sometimes we aggressively combat them on Twitter, or sometimes they come to us through email or a 24/7 helpline. Then we start having a conversation with an individual, but we don't just have an ability then at Parallel Networks to say, you're wrong and you should change. We have an ability to say you're wrong and you should change, but you have the ability to take that energy that you allocated into the extremist movement and to experience the same sort of things that they gave you, right, in a productive manner, that you can transform that. And that we believe that by working with other people that have already undergone that process, it's almost like an NA and AA meeting, a support system and a support network. And then we get to benefit from their skills. A woman left recently that was a woman who was a propagandist for the neo-Nazis. She was getting their podcast on Spotify, and she was craftily designing some of the flyers that they were using and designing their website. She did the graphic design for 2 articles in our recent magazine, and that was a way for us to talk with her and get to know her better, but also to utilize her skill set and then make her feel like she was doing something productive to make amends and further facilitate the de-radicalization process. So we try to come up with ways to address hate and extremism that are as complex as the ways that the extremists are with regard to creating an entire system. Once you enter an extremist movement and you fall down that rabbit hole, that's your life. Every piece of information that you get, every piece of interaction with another human being that you get that you would actually consider worthwhile and human is there for you and offered for you. It's not sufficient to just say, this message is wrong, the ideology is wrong, you should not believe in this any longer. It's also necessary to think about how we can provide that same sort of network that extremists offer.
I just have one quick follow-up on that, because I know when people hear, this work about bringing people out using the same complex ways of bringing them out that they got in and using their skills, I think people generally like, well, is that really working? I think there's a lot of people who don't necessarily believe when somebody changes, which I think is also part of human nature. So can you just talk a little bit about the difficulties in dealing with formers? And I don't mean to reveal like specifics about a person, but where are some of the challenges that you face in trying to help somebody help themselves?
Well, I mean, we have to understand that it's a process, it's not an event, number one. And we don't just work with former extremists. We have victims of extremism. We have people that have volunteered, that have been inspired by our work, that do things like trauma treatment. We have former cult members. We have former gang members. And what we're able to do is weekly, we have these get-togethers online where we spend about 2 hours, and everybody that we're bringing into the movement can hear from someone else. This is where a former neo-Nazi gets to talk to an African-American woman whose father was killed when she was 8 years old by a white supremacist and who is now a life coach that works with some of our people. This is where a person who grew up in a Christian Science Monitor cult that is now a professional in trauma treatment and works for the National Academy of Sciences can get in there and share some of her experiences, and the cult-like similarities come out. So it's those conversations that are doing the de-radicalization work. So you disengage from a movement is not the same as completely building up a new worldview to believe in. And by being surrounded by those different messages, and then at the same time doing the one-on-one work, like I work with former right-wing extremists every day now, and have to dissect race theory, or race science, have to dissect the Great Replacement, and have to explain that it's really not that different. Osama bin Laden's sort of war against the Zionist Crusader Alliance is not any different than the right wing's version of the Zionist occupied government. And you can see those similarities, and then you can get into the nuances, and then the rational stuff starts to change. So there's a further facilitation. It's tough work, but there's definitely a huge appetite for it. People are open, but they have to be given a constant ability to absorb that information. And to reduce spatial and temporal restriction, we have to do it at a group level rather than one-on-one.
And, you know, this idea of change is something that you have to test out. And in fact, you know, it's an interesting anecdote. When Jesse was in prison in Northern Virginia, you know, put away, largely driven by the NYPD and our team that was focusing on Revolution Muslim, we weren't sure if his change was genuine. We had 2 undercovers visit him in their undercover role and sort of tested him out. We sent an analyst down there. We sent a team of very different people to try and assess whether this was genuine or was this some type of, you know, some type of scam to get out of the situation. And, you know, with all these people, they're in transition. It's not a one-day change, I'm in, I'm out. There's a transition process, and you have to have people sort of testing them and seeing how they react to different stimuli to be as sure as you can that this is a genuine change of heart, repentance, recantation of their previous beliefs. It's, you know, it's not science, there's a little bit of an art to it too.
Right. And so, you know, giving people an alternative, a way out, hope is what we heard. You know, in the Center on Extremism, one of the ways that we feel, you know, a tool in the toolbox is to actually track and try to stop attacks from happening. That's another proactive thing that's happening. And I will say, in my 20 years at ADL, I've never had law enforcement reach out to us as much as they have had in the last couple of years. Nor have we provided as much proactive information because of the state that we're in. So Carolyn, can you talk a bit about our work sharing information with law enforcement to keep communities safe?
I would be more than happy to. I love to brag about my team as much as I possibly can, and the people that I work with are the most incredible people you will ever meet.
I agree.
Including Oren, I guess. But 2 things that I'd say about our work with law enforcement is the first, that there's limitations when you're in law enforcement and you're trying to track these individuals. Be it you can't store information about someone for a certain amount of time, or you can't access platforms because of different rules. So our team, we're basically a treasure trove of information about individuals spanning back years. And so we can give law enforcement information about someone who was an extremist 10 years ago or is a burgeoning extremist right now. And that is one thing. And the other thing is, when we see something and we decide that it's actionable, someone is on one of the chans, 4chan or 8chan, posting about wanting to target a specific synagogue. We have partners all across the country with whom we can share that information, and we know that that threat will be addressed. There are a couple anecdotes from the past year that, again, my colleagues had a major role in stopping. The first being in April 2019, this individual was posting on a multitude of these online platforms that we've been talking about with the screen name shekel, the Israeli currency, using that, posting a whole host of anti-Semitic tropes and horrific, racist, Islamophobic, and anti-Semitic language. And in addition to this active presence online, he also made it a point to go out and spray anti-Semitic graffiti in a park, as well as deface a Jewish center in Chabad, Maryland, putting up stickers, white supremacist stickers, anti-Semitic stickers, and posted a picture of that. And not so lucky for him, our fantastic people were able to identify, one, exactly where that happened. He had he didn't say where he was. We were able to look actually at the reflection of the window, a building behind him in this picture, and identify exactly where this had happened, and give that information to law enforcement and stop yet potentially another horrific massacre from happening. More recently, this was a little more personal for ADL. Everything is personal, but this is directly targeting one of our regional offices. In August 2019, another individual, kind of same setup, he was posting horrific anti-Semitic, racist messages, and actually had demonstrated that he had access to bomb-making materials. And he had decided that he wanted to target an LGBTQ bar, as well as our regional office in Las Vegas. And ADL, again, kind of going back to our ability to store information, we'd had information on him in the past, and we'd shared that with law enforcement. And so we were able to give them the context that they needed to make a decision to pursue him and arrest him.
Yeah, it's kind of like the subway ride here in New York every day. If you see something, say something, right? So we just see a lot and we say a lot, but it's true. And frankly, this I want to go to Mitch now to put on your sort of former law enforcement hat. How is law enforcement dealing with this issue right now? Domestic extremism, this rise. Do you think that there's resources for this threat? Do they have enough of what they need?
Well, first I also want to applaud the Center on Extremism because, in fact, in my former role at NYPD, we interacted with Oren's team, and there was always a lot of useful information that they might make us aware of because, trying to monitor the internet is like trying to, monitor the ocean. It's impossible for any one organization to do. So it's really a phenomenal team you've put together. And, the way that, Caroline described it, that's how we did it too, in a sense. You need to be in the right chat rooms. You need to be in Jesse's former Pal Talk room. You need to be on the Telegram channel to find these indicators, these clues, these faint signals that someone is radicalizing and may turn towards violence. So you need a specialty team to do it. So that's capabilities. NYPD, because of NYPD and great leadership, we're able to do that. The FBI, is moving in that direction. They were quick to develop skills, focusing on the terrorism threat, thinking about Al Qaeda first and then the Islamic State. But what's being called the domestic threat, domestic terrorism, DT, that now requires a shift in resources. And I think, unfortunately, it often takes sort of blood on the ground for big organizations to shift their focus and allocate the resources. Going back to something like 2012, there was an analyst of the Department of Homeland Security who said, hey, wait a second, there's this pattern where some, disaffected veterans who come home from foreign wars, there's a tendency in the history of the United States, some of them get attracted to white extremist movements. There was a huge outcry, the report got deep-sixed, and it didn't lead to the development of capacity and resources devoted to that threat then. I think, unfortunately, Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso have focused the U.S. government on this issue, and that's driven the Bureau to allocate more resources, to that threat, as well as a whole of government. Even the National Counterterrorism Center is talking about DT, domestic terrorism, where their remit had traditionally been overseas terrorism.
It's tricky, though, because a lot of what we're looking for as indicators of potential violent or violent extremism is completely protected speech. Right, and so that raises this issue of, do we want law enforcement to be able to, just investigate anybody because of, what they're saying? And the thing about America is you can kind of be as hateful as you want, and so we have to be able to research the threat with keeping civil liberties sort of in mind as well, and I think that's a challenge. I think the other thing is that, it's much easier, and you correct me if I'm wrong, to sort of investigate somebody who's motivated by ISIS or Al Qaeda or other foreign terrorist organization ideology because they're designated terrorist organizations. You can't provide any support. We don't have domestic terror lists in this country, right? And by the way, it wouldn't even be practical. So I'm not suggesting that we should, because most extremists are not actually part of a group or a movement. They're individuals who are, responding to ideology, much of which they're finding online, and so it wouldn't even really be practical. The only change I can see maybe, and frankly, this is just going by what we're seeing is the global terror threat that white supremacy now represents. And so if we see, white supremacists in Europe and New Zealand or anywhere else who are actually providing operational instructions to American white supremacists, seems like maybe they would be designated like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And I actually think we're probably heading in that way, again, because online environments are creating it that it is a global terror threat. The Christchurch shooter had the 14 written on his gun as he was shooting people. 14 is the 14 words. This American pie white supremacist slogan, we must secure the existence of our race and a future of white children. Let me stop there because I'm getting a little emotional. There's a lot of really, really good questions here, so I'd like to turn to these and we'll take it from here. Okay, so the first one is, if extremists utilize social media, is there another platform that can be used to combat them? And maybe I'm thinking, Jesse, you mentioned the magazines that you created. So maybe it's not another platform, but can you talk about that?
So what we have built out at Parallel Networks is an ecosystemic approach to combating polarization, hate, and extremism. You can find the hub of our work at lightuponlight.online. And that's based upon a statement from Albert Einstein that no problem has ever been solved at the same level of consciousness that creates it, and that the verse is itself a reference to a Quranic verse that's called Light Upon Light. That is built into an online arena that's connected to social media that offers an array of information. Every 10 days we roll over the website with new articles that are written by volunteers or former extremists or whatnot. We have constant release of people that are working with us. We call them our shapeshifters and our influencers, which gives us figureheads that will formulate as a movement in the same way that extremists build up their own networks. And then that counter-narrative work that we do, which is tailored. So I started and Mitch monitored English language jihadi magazines that have been some of the greatest examples of weaponization of propaganda, probably in modern history. And we took it back. We made a productive counter-narrative to that. That magazine is housed on that website where people can find it as a tool of preventing a trek into extremism, but we also aggressively embed that in those dark net channels that are located on platforms like Telegram. We recently launched, because the Jihadist Magazine initiative was successful, a counter right-wing initiative called Control, Alt, Delete, Hate, which is our counter-narrative paradigm, but it's also our methodology for personal and collective change. We have to control the space between stimulus and response, alter course, and address extremism, and address the contextual and cultural problems. Sometimes the grievances are legitimate at a higher level of consciousness that created it, and predominantly in a manner that's committed to nonviolence. And that to delete hate is our efforts to impart a better understanding that every one of us has a role to play in combating hate and extremism in this age of hyperpolarization and partisanship, particularly at a political level. And then we provide the intervention services by linking those initiatives to the fact that we have the person who American History X was based on as an interventionist in-house. We have an African-American female whose father was a jazz musician who was killed by a white supremacist. We have members of cults, as I stated earlier, where all of these people are there to talk to you one-on-one if you want to find out more about what we're building out. So it's really the same process that extremists offer, a generalized message meant to facilitate a one-on-one engagement, meant to facilitate the broader resonance of that message by pulling people in. They don't have to be extremists. We get contacted every day by researchers, by activists, by people that are in unrelated fields but are starting to be affected by this conversation about white supremacy, pulling them together and taking their energy and putting it online at our lightuponlight.online ecosystem allows us to create a counter-narrative that rivals in size and scope the extremists. That's the most important part of building that out.
And by the I just want to add that I think it also helps that when the public discussion is echoing some of the type of tropes that we have generally seen on the fringes over the years, that people use their voice to speak out against that wherever it may occur, right? Because ultimately, this time will be remembered not just for the mainstreaming of hate, how it's become sort of ubiquitous, but what people did to respond. And that includes becoming allies with people and standing up when anybody is speaking out and normalizing this form of hate. All right, question 2. Caroline, how does the COE staff emotionally handle all the hate and calls for violence that they see every single day? How do you fight burnout?
That's a really good question, and some of our newer members are in the audience, so. But
So this is a lesson for them.
well, we talk about our team, and the word team is not said lightly. Like, we lean on each other for a lot, be it a hard day. I remember I have been ADL for about 2.5 years, and my second month on the job, Charlottesville happened. And my coworker at the time, she was on the ground monitoring the events, and every single person on that team dropped what they were doing that weekend and came together, went to their computers, were on the phone with our colleague on the ground to make sure she had the support that she needed. And it goes so much more above just colleague relationships. It's really like a family and friendships. And not only is it a support network, but like Oren alluded to earlier, you also sort of need to look at something this heavy with a little bit of levity. And so there will be some extremist jokes that we share with each other. Or,
No.
Never. No, but just trying to lighten each other's burdens in whatever ways that we can, but also just relying on our relationships with each other and talking to each other when we need to and picking up the phone, because we're all around the country, but you know that there's always going to be that person on the other end who's going to pick up and talk you through whatever you need to kind of talk out.
Yeah, we don't have a psychologist on staff, but I do believe that the team actually serves as psychologists for one another. And by the way, we really need a psychologist on staff. And also alcohol helps. Okay, next is, here's another question. One issue with policy in this area is potential abuse. How do we design policies that are not taken and misused? Like how DHS has focused on black identity extremists instead of white nationalists for the past 2 years.
Look, any type of intelligence effort, just by the nature of intelligence, you want to know as much as you can about all the different range of threats that are out there, because ultimately your job is to protect. So that's the motivation. But having an architecture or a legal framework that puts limitations on that is also a good thing. And those limitations sort of set the parameters as to what are the what standards do you have to meet before you open an investigation? What standards do you meet before you have to renew investigation? A more widespread investigation. So there needs to be some type of architecture or framework that's in place that puts those parameters in place, those guardrails, if you will, to make sure that you have that. At NYPD, we had that. We were under something called the hand-shoe consent decree, and that dictated what allowed us to open up a preliminary investigation, what allowed us to open up a full investigation, and when they came up for renewal, sometimes they didn't get renewed because they didn't meet that legal criteria, as there's enough evidence to suggest that there's some possible link to criminality here.
Right. There's multiple questions here, Jesse, about, like, the question essentially is, what happened, why did you change?
Oh, it's a rather long story. I'll try to give it in 3 minutes, max.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as was mentioned, I was located out of New York City here and started to radicalize in an organization called the Islamic Thinkers Society, which was connected to Al-Muhajirun, which was the predominant and continues to be the predominant English language radicalizing element that started this whole thing. We adopted the position that they were too soft. So we split off because we wanted to unabashedly promote Osama bin Laden's views and say, utilizing the First Amendment, what they couldn't do in the UK, where Al-Muhajirun was located, that we loved Osama bin Laden more than we loved ourselves, so to say. In the course of doing that work, we continued to get more and more extreme and to challenge the First Amendment, and ultimately we threatened the writers of South Park for portraying the Prophet Muhammad in a cartoon. Right? Knowing after my co-defendant, who would become my co-defendant, the individual that sort of launched those threats against the South Park writers, that likely the time was up, that I had violated the First Amendment. I got on a plane and fled to Morocco. And my ex-wife is from Morocco, and my children are essentially Moroccan. And so I was living there, and I fell off the radar for a good 2 months when I first got there out of sort of strategy. I couldn't stay shut up, and I didn't de-radicalize, but while I was there, I was teaching Moroccan youth for their GRE and their GMAT score so that they could go to the West to study. And they were wondering what the hell I was doing in Morocco, and I was wondering what the hell they wanted to do to travel to the West and lose their Islamic identity. But the Arab Spring broke out. And it was really a time for even jihadists to question. I mean, even Al-Qaeda started to say, well, we needed more popular mobilization because this is really a good thing. ISIS, on the other hand, was like, well, the Islamic State in Iraq was like, we should blow stuff up. This is a good opportunity. So we already saw those fragments coming, and the jihadi community was already in conflict. But also living in the time of the Arab Spring, and in Morocco, it sort of allowed me to question a lot of what I had become. And it was a myriad of factors. Didn't matter because I was ultimately arrested anyway. I spent 5 months in a Moroccan prison waiting for extradition back to the United States. More time to think, more time to reflect, more time to realize the consequences of my action. I met Mohammed Fizazi, who was a radical Salafi jihadi cleric who had changed. He got out of prison after I met him and started to write op-eds, so it was my first contact with a former extremist. The FBI and US government came to pick me up, flew me back to Alexandria Detention Center in Virginia, where I was housed in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. A guard there would take me to the law library for her 10-hour shifts, and it was there that I had access to the general library and found myself in possession of the Encyclopedia Britannica's great books of the Western world and the Enlightenment philosophers connected with intellectuals like Nassim Nicholas Taleb was very influential with regard to behavioral economics, founding fathers' biographies, Thomas Paine, et cetera, and started to re-identify with the person I tried to kill because I couldn't stand who I was born, Jesse Morton, but Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, the person I became, started to wear off as well. And ultimately was just given an opportunity when I had to do a debriefing process with the FBI to interact with law enforcement and to realize that I was absolutely wrong about portraying this idea that the law enforcement community and the war on terror was a war against Islam. The only thing that they were worried about was making sure that people that used to follow me did not go on to become terrorists. And there was a female empathetic FBI agent that saw that and accepted that I might be sincere and that I might be an asset. People kept reaching out to me. They were traveling to be in Syria, et cetera, and so I became an informant of sorts and was released after originally being sentenced to 11 and a half years in prison on March 1st, 2015, and then had to undergo the long process of reentry and reintegration from incarceration. Fell apart after going public as America's first former jihadist and realized that the distinction between disengagement and de-radicalization. I relapsed on drugs and alcohol once you took away the Islamic ideology that was the opiate. I went back to the person that entered the movement in the first place and relapsed and used alcohol and narcotics for the first time in 14 years. And so I've been building that off of that and realizing that I had to address the underlying trauma that made me susceptible to participation in the extremist movement in the first place.
Thank you for sharing that. We have time for just a couple more questions. So this is for anyone. How prolific is the threat? How widespread is the problem? And I think this is the important part, the second part. What can we do individually to not make ourselves crazy with worry and fear? So maybe I'll start. So when we're talking about extremists across the ideological spectrum, we are still very much talking about the fringes of the fringes in this society. And we talk about the mainstreaming of these tropes, whether it's on our phones or in the public discussion, and that's real, right? Things remain fringe because people work to keep them on the fringe. But we have also seen a series of deadly attacks in this country. A lot of them of recent vintage have been carried out by right-wing extremists. So I think historically we have thought of terrorism, and Mitch alluded to this, as a threat from abroad, right? That we are importing somehow extremist ideas and extremists themselves. The truth is that we are exporting extremism every single day. And so I actually think the threat is significant, not because of just the numbers that we see. 433 extremist-related murders in the last 10 years. 73% of those being carried out by right-wing extremists, the majority of those by white supremacists. That doesn't mean that we have a luxury to ignore any threat. And the reality is that anybody has access to the ability to become extreme now. So that's not hyperbole, But I don't think we need to worry every single day, in part because we have people doing this work to protect, but because you actually have a role that you can play to mitigate this. Be invested in what your kids are looking at. Be an ally to those communities that are being targeted. Use your voice and speak out. Don't feel like you're neutered. That, frankly, is empowering. I'm going to tell just one quick anecdote. I was speaking with the parents of a kid who was killed by a white supremacist actually not too long ago. And they had these memorial pages, and they were being harassed online through these memorial pages, people celebrating the death of their child. And I asked them, because after, of course, expressing my deepest sympathies to that, give me the handles of the people that are harassing you. I want to see who's doing that. And they provided that information. And we did a little research on our team to try to identify. And, it's hard to identify everybody. They don't use their real names. But we identified a portion of them. And these were 13, 14, and 15-year-olds. These were not hardcore white supremacists. These were not people steeped in the movement. These are people who thought it was hilarious. They thought it was ironic. It was sort of this meme culture. So there are spaces to mitigate this early on. And ADL, for example, educates 1.5 million students every year to be critical thinkers, to fight against stereotypes and bias, and how to not be an innocent bystander when it happens. And I actually think that that matters. So that's one way that you should not worry, is know that people are doing work to reach out to those that are susceptible. Anything else to add there?
I'll jump in on that. We've been talking about how pervasive extremism is online, but to harp on Oren's point, I think it really starts with the insular networks, be it your kids, as parents, you watch them, you watch their friends, and then you do things like come to talks like this and support organizations like the ADL. And I think when we think about extremism and the seriousness of the threat, it still is something that is, on your own news feeds or when you're on these networks, it's very minimal compared to everything else that's around you. But another, I think, important point when we think about this is to not be convinced by stereotypes, especially in the extremist field. Like for me, looking at Islamist extremism, it could be anyone. I always say, and Oren and I in our conversations, it's anyone on the train. It's not one profile, not one demographic. And mostly, actually, it's US citizens who are susceptible to this type of ideology. And the last point is that as of late, we're actually seeing, these processes that we've been talking about today and how people are radicalized. We're seeing kind of a mixing of ideologies. Last December, there was a guy arrested for targeting a synagogue in Ohio who was inspired by ISIS, but he cited the Pittsburgh shooter, Bowers, and said, I want to do what he did. And it's this supposed Islamist extremist citing a white supremacist. And it's these ideologies that are usually, they butt heads, but you look and you see they're actually sourcing inspiration from the kind of very opposite ideologies that they're supposed to be against.
The online space enables you to choose your own adventure, right? For all of us. And sometimes we choose this music or this thing. And for extremism, it's the same. And actually, I think we're going to be seeing more of these sort of self-created ideologies and the ability to send them out there to hope to get adherence. And that's sort of the future of extremist movements. And we talk about Islamists and what does that mean, and white supremacist, white nationalism. Eventually, we just need to understand that the mechanisms in which this is happening, we need to respond to. I really appreciate the work that you do, Jesse, every day, and Mitch, working with these formers, bringing people together through parallel networks, et cetera. I also really appreciate, Caroline, being able to work with you every day and the team that we have in the Center on Extremism, which I can't tell you how much is dedicated to keeping communities safe, not just the Jewish community, but all communities. And I'm literally half a minute away, and I thank you all for choosing this panel, and we'll be around, I think, for a little while if you want to ask questions. Thank you.
pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.